SNP spokesman Alan Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Shadow Minister. I agree with what she said. I welcome her comments on devolution protecting the devolved parliaments. Also do welcome the commitment from Labour if they're in government to repeal this legislation, but I would point out that there's already been a number of Labour U-turns recently, and now we've heard the mantra Labour's not going to be in power to do the job of repealing nasty Tory legislation. So there is a concern that actually Labour won't do what's promised at the dispatch box. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's also amazing that, again, from intervention with Tory benches, we heard the mantra, the Tories are the party of workers. The party of workers that don't even have one backbench contribution for the Lord's amendments today. That's how interested they are in the workers in reality. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, turn to the Lord's amendments. Amendment 1 is very welcome, but I do have to point out, it's slightly bizarre, that it was Labour Lords that voted through this amendment, which limits the territorial extent to England, while Labour MPs previously abstained in our Amendment 32, which was for consent of the Scottish Parliament to be required for the bill to apply to Scotland. So, why did the Labour MPs not vote for our Amendment 32 previously? Was that because of the Bain principle? What has changed? But hopefully what it does mean is that Lord's Amendment 1 means that Labour does recognise the democratic deficit of Westminster overruling the wishes of the devolved administrations. It means recognising it's for the devolved administration to decide what's right for our nations. So by default, as per my intervention question earlier, what this means is Labour should now be recognising the need for employment rights to be devolved. Now, the STUC backed this position as well. The General Secretary of the Scottish Trades Union Congress, Ros Foyer, previously stating that now, more than ever, Scotland needs a devolution of employment law to outlaw, once and for all, the use of zero-hours contracts, giving workers security, certainty and workplace rights from day one of their employment. So it really is time that Labour get on board with the concept and commit to the devolution of employment rights and legislation for that. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's also worth noting that there is no need for Lord's amendments to protect Northern Ireland in terms of territorial extent. Now, that's because it was Labour who actually previously devolved employment law to the Northern Ireland Assembly. So again, if it's good enough for Northern Ireland, then clearly the so-called most powerful devolved parliament in the world should also have employment law devolved. Now, the dispatch box, the Minister actually tried to justify Westminster interfering yet again because somehow Wales and Scotland will otherwise be disproportionately hit with strikes if Westminster doesn't impose its will. But the reality is, Scotland's had the fewest and the lowest strike action out of all the nations, and that's because we've got better trade union relations and have actually negotiated in good faith with the unions. So that's how we get less strike action, not Westminster imposing legislation onto the Parliament that we don't want. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, also 61 Liberal Democrat Lords voted for Lord's Amendment 1, so the same challenge now goes to the Lib Dems. Do they now agree that employment-related legislation should be devolved? The honourable member usually likes to intervene, but it'd be good to know what the Lib Dem position is in employment law if they're voting to protect Scotland in terms of territorial extent. Finally, we're not getting anything for the Lib Dems. Finally, if we're talking about the theme of democratic deficits, Madam Deputy Speaker, isn't it incredible? There's 14 elected Liberal Democrat MPs in this House and 83 Liberal Lords down the road. Doesn't that just show the democratic deficit of the unelected place? Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the key thing about Lord's Amendment 1 is that in protecting the devolved administrations from this Tory assault on workers' rights, it also respects the rights of the wishes of the voters in the devolved nations. Now, the Tories can loosely argue that they had a transport minimum services bill as part of their manifesto previously, and they can argue they were voted in to deliver in their manifesto. However, given that the Tories were roundly rejected once again in Scotland and Wales, it's quite clear the Tories did not have any mandate whatsoever to implement this bill in Scotland or Wales. Now, also, as we pointed out previously, and as Liberty and others have observed, and the Shadow Minister observed as well, this bill also allows unknown assaults in the devolved administrations. The Henry VIII clauses to allow both existing and future legislation to be overruled is completely outrageous. Now, the Tories continually deny making power grabs while they're actually enacting enabling legislation to actually interfere in devolved matters. And again, the comments for the dispatch box illustrated that perfectly. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, now we've got the genius that is Lord Frost, who negotiated the Brexit deal that he now tells us is absolutely rubbish, and he's now arguing for powers to be stripped from the Scottish Parliament. So, as the Tories lurch further to the right, what's to say his view won't prevail? So the Lord's amendment in itself actually doesn't prevent other attacks and devolution, but it does stop anti-strike legislation being imposed in the devolved administrations. So I fully support Lord's Amendment 1, while recognising the need that we still need to fully devolve employment law. Now, turning to Amendment 2, I have to start by saying, yet again, that this entire bill is shameful in its intent. It gives way too much power to the government, and it's been rammed through Parliament. Indeed, not only was impact assessment published after the bill went through the Commons, it was classed as not fit for purpose by the Regulatory Policy Committee. So Lord's Amendment 2 adds a bit of transparency by requiring the government to consult on minimum service levels and assess the impact on the right to strike, as well as assessing the effectiveness in services and impact to the wider public. Information that in reality the government should be seeking to understand anyway. So therefore the government should actually embrace this amendment instead of opposing it. And otherwise, this is about demonstrating their intent isn't actually solely about government imposition in conflict with trade unions and employees. So they really should think again about supporting that Lord's Amendment. Now, it's also worth remembering that while the UK Government likes to remind us, and that happened earlier when the Minister was at the dispatch box, that minimum service levels exist in other countries, but as I said previously, the requirements are agreed through negotiation. And previously, the European TUE General Secretary Esther Lynn said the UK already has among the most draconian restrictions on the right to strike in Europe. And the UK Government's plans would push it even further away from normal democratic practice across Europe. So when the Minister quotes what goes on in other European countries, he really should actually read up much better. So this Lord's Amendment, Amendment 2, doesn't even bring the UK back in line with international norms, but provides more transparency and shouldn't actually be controversial. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we come to Amendments 4 and 5 and the consequential Amendments 6 and 7, Amendment 4 seeks to remove what is absolutely the most pernicious aspect of this bill, the concept that employers can name particular individuals to for them to comply with a work notice, forcing them to make that horrible decision whether to either cross a picket line or risk being sacked for exercising what should be their fundamental right to strike for fair pay and conditions. And no matter the flannel the government puts on this about the minimum service levels that exist in other countries, the sacking of individual workers for non-compliance will make the UK an international outlier. Now, Amendment 4 will rectify this by ensuring that a breach of a work notice is not a sackable offence, which of course is the international norm. Now, Amendment 5 removes another awful part of this bill, which is the removal of protections for the unions. It should not even be considered remotely acceptable that the government is putting obligations on unions to ensure that employees comply with work notices. Now, as pointed out by Liberty, proving unions haven't taken reasonable steps is actually completely unworkable, especially as the government hasn't even defined what reasonable steps actually would look like. And the government also needs to understand the wider and real concerns in the human rights around this bill. As the Joint Committee on Human Rights wrote in their report on the bill, they wrote, "We find it hard to see how it is compliant with Article 11 of the ECHR to expose any participant in industrial action to the risk of dismissal simply because a trade union fails to take the unspecified reasonable steps." They also said that, in our view, the government has not provided sufficient justification for this consequence or explained why the minimum service scheme could not be effective without it. So quite clearly, Amendment 5 has to remain in place to prevent this breach of human rights. The JCHR also highlighted the lack of an alternative mechanism allowing for independent resolution of disagreements which would meet the standards of the ILO, and the outrageous aspect of employers being able to claim up to £1 million in damages against unions. Now, even worse in terms of how it operates, Section 234E of the schedule forces unions into effectively acting in a manner contrary to their very purpose, forcing them to work against the interests of their members and undermine their own legal strike action. So the bill, as it stands, is just a vehicle for conflict with unions and employees, and it's so obvious, and it's a sign of a government with no long-term intention of collegiate collective bargaining, and a government that wants to do their best to make unions and strikes impotent, instead of understanding that striking is actually a last resort following failed negotiations in the first place. Now, Amendment 4 also rightfully puts the duties on the employer both to serve a notice and to prove they've served it correctly on an individual. If we have to believe the premise from the government that minimum service levels are all about health and safety and protection of life, then it should hardly be onerous to expect an employer to ensure that work notices are correctly served. Now, in summary, the government should be accepting Amendments 4, 5, 6 and 7, assuming the government does win their votes tonight. I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Lords do the right thing and reinstate these amendments as well as Amendment 2. And on Amendment 1, there is no small irony as the unelected Labour and Liberal Lords who recognise the democratic deficits of Scotland and Wales have an unwanted policies imposed upon us. So now real is the time that Labour needs to recognise that these Lords and amendments are at best a sticking plaster, and we need full devolution of employment law and workers' rights to Scotland, and Labour must commit to this if they're going to form part of the next Westminster Government. So while we obviously want full independence, full devolution of employment law is a pragmatic step forward, and that reflects the wishes of the trade unions, which I'd hope a proper Labour Party would be reflective of, because we know that lot over there certainly aren't listening.